The chants of "I can't breathe" are being replaced by shrieks of "defund the police" in wake of the George Floyd death in Minneapolis. Is it time to scale back on the firepower? Hello and welcome to the Unpublished Cafe. I'm Ed Hand. Floyd's death was the catalyst for anti-racism demonstrations and protests in the U.S., Canada, and across Europe. The role of police very much on their minds. For some, it's an adversarial relationship. Several U.S. cities are now scaling back on police funding and putting those funds towards health and at-risk youth programs. L.A. and New York, the largest cities so far. In the city of Toronto, two councillors have brought a motion forward to cut the Toronto police budget by 10%, although the premier is not in support. Now, part of the problem with the phrase "defund the police" is, well, it's not exactly literal. It's not like we won't have officers and police stations at all. Coming up on the Unpublished Cafe, we're going to take a look at the issue of defunding police and whether we'll reduce these conflicts or lead to more crime. Alex Del Carmen's a PhD, Associate Dean, and Professor at the School of Criminology, Criminal Justice, and Strategic Studies at Tarleton State University, and he joins us. And Alex, are you surprised by the call again for defunding police?
I'm not surprised about the anger that is taking place across the world and really in the United States towards policing. But I am surprised that folks are asking to either restructure the budget or to simply defund it altogether, because I think it sets a very dangerous precedent here.
And what's the precedent?
Well, even though, constitutionally and theoretically and practically, law enforcement do work for the citizens that pay taxes unquestionably. And at the end of the day, they are respondent to the citizenry. I think sometimes people that, especially politicians, that do not really fully understand the work of police officers and the complexities associated with them, when we put those budgets in their hands to start cutting it back as a form of punishment or retribution for what happened to Mr. Floyd, which in itself was a horrible act, it's really dangerous because I don't know that I want a police officer to show up at my house that is not well equipped with all the training that's necessary to be able to do his or her job.
How did police services become such a large portion of a city's budget?
Well, that's happened over the years, right? Because law enforcement in itself has become more and more complicated, more professionalized. And at the same time, cities have grown. Therefore, there was a need for more police officers. And quite honestly, the job of a police officer has also changed, right? So over the years, we've seen that in many cases, they've been asked to intervene in areas where they're quite honestly not trained to intervene, as it relates to domestic violence, for instance, as it relates to other things that are really more about social workers and counselors to provide services than police officers.
Yeah, it seems that it's a big umbrella that they cover now. They have to pretty well be everything to everybody.
Right. And I think that, we've seen this in the past where police officers are called whenever, your cat is on a tree and fails to come down the tree. And, who do you call? 911. Back when 9/11 took place and there were concerns about, bioterrorist attacks, people began to call 911 throughout the country when they start seeing, what they described as white dust coming from the clouds, which turned out to be nothing more than pollen, right? So at the end of the day, people call 911 as almost as muscle reflex as opposed to a need. And I think the job of a police officer has extended to areas that they never thought it was possible.
When we look at and talk about defunding police, I recall you mentioned this is going to become a state problem. How is that?
Well, at the end of the day, law enforcement is dependent upon local taxes. And most of the law enforcement in the United States, I would argue probably 80 to 85% of it is at the local and state level. Federal law enforcement is a very small portion of the law enforcement component. The FBI estimates that we have 1 million police officers in the streets of the United States on a given day. I would argue 85 to 87% of those are state and local. And so at the end of the day, this is going to really trickle down to that state budget and to the local budgets as to whether or not cities, municipalities, and whatnot are the ones that are going to say yes or no to the decrease of the budget or reappropriation of budgets or to the elimination of law enforcement altogether in that jurisdiction.
Obviously, police officers are the image is taking a pretty bad rap right now, but we do need them no matter what. Uh, do we have to come up with a new way of training, a new way of seeing how police become part of the community, as opposed to it seems almost adversarial, yeah, in a sense, is it not?
Yeah, I mean, look, in the past, probably 50 years, we've seen law enforcement change roles altogether, right? And I am one to say that I think there needs to be change. And ever since Mr. Floyd died, I remember reading about it and watching the news the day after and making comments to my friends and colleagues saying this one's different, because the death of George Floyd, it's really going to change, I believe, the fabric of law enforcement in the United States and perhaps even throughout the world, to the extent that I think, and I hope that good change comes out of this.
Hmm.
I hope that a greater level of communication between the citizens, and law enforcement, begin to emerge. But there are so many bridges to cross. There are so many challenges to address because that relationship has eroded over the years. And even though the majority of Americans support law enforcement as a concept, I think that there is lack of trust, particularly in the minority communities and in other places throughout the United States.
Do you believe that, as we say, defunding the police, or obviously going more to a community policing model, less budget, do you think that's going to lead to more crime?
He may, look, I think that at the end of the day, what I'm concerned about is that everyone seems to have a great idea after Mr. Floyd died, and everyone seems to have an opinion as to where we should go. But I think this has become so politicized in the past few weeks
Mm.
that, in my view, and obviously I'm biased in the sense that I'm a social scientist, I'm a PhD in criminology, having studied policing for 22 years and training thousands, literally thousands of police officers throughout the United States. And, I was on a Fulbright last year in the Czech Republic training police officers there. And I can tell you that at the end of the day, when you look at it, this is not a decision for politicians to make, right? This has to be based on science. This has to be based on what works and what doesn't work. And my concern is that if we start sort of, a split hairing, splitting the hair of the budget and sending it to one social service because that seems to make the headlines today versus something else, that we're going to put law enforcement in even a more difficult situation where we may have tragedies ahead of us that we're not even able to predict.
Alex, I want to thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Alex Del Carmen is Associate Dean and Professor at the School of Criminology, Criminal Justice, and Strategic Studies at Tarleton State University. For some, the idea of defunding the police is an opportunity for municipalities. Tahir Duckett's a civil rights lawyer and founder of the Rethink organization in Washington, D.C., and he joins us now. And Tahir, how do you feel this is an opportunity for cities and towns?
Well, I think it's a huge opportunity to reclaim giant percentages of their budgets that they have devoted to programs that aren't necessarily delivering what people believe that they are delivering, right? Policing is, anywhere between 30% of municipal budgets in certain cities, all the way up to half, places like Oakland, California. And these are giant sums of money that we're talking about. Even in mid-sized cities, you're talking hundreds of millions of dollars, and in big cities, billions of dollars that we're spending on policing. And so for cities who are interested in putting together programs that are going to be really beneficial for these neighborhoods, this is a lot of money that we are devoting to an institution that, it turns out, isn't really serving us.
Do police services unions have too much sway over some of these city budgets?
Well, I think the problem is less with the unions and more with policing itself, right? The unions are simply a reflection of what's happening deep within the institution. These unions are democratically elected. They reflect, every time you see a union president or a statement from a police union that is, blaming blaming everybody but themselves for the sort of violence that you're seeing from police officers in the streets against protesters, and the ongoing violence that we see against Black communities. Those are folks who are elected and reelected by police officers themselves. And so I think that they're reflective of something that's going on within the institution, which is where I think the real problem is. We've allowed a giant group of people who have the authority to use lethal force against us, and have been trained to believe that their lives are in danger at every given moment. And we have, unleashed them into our streets as kind of warriors and standing armies. And then we are surprised when they turn around and, don't want to be held accountable for their actions. And so that is, I think, the central problem that we're facing when it comes to policing. And, it's one that runs so deep that a lot of people are saying the solution isn't to reform it. It is to shrink the size and shrink the scope of what it is that we're asking these folks to do in the first place.
You had mentioned when we talked about going back to community policing and the unions, Camden, New Jersey was looked at as a community that defunded police, and in an effort to reduce crime and to save some money. Would you have considered it a success?
Yeah, Camden, New Jersey, I wouldn't say that they're a place that defunded the police. All they did was they rebuilt their police department. Now, look, Camden, New Jersey's department for a long time was among the most horrifying police departments in the country, and that's saying something given what we've seen across the country these last few weeks. So what they did was they did dismantle their police department, but what that meant for them was that they busted their union. They fired a bunch of cops. They fired all the cops. They rehired the ones that they thought that they could reform. They brought in a reformist police chief, and they, went about their business just, policing with something of a lighter touch. I think that that does not really get to the central problems that we're facing when it comes to policing, which is that, we're spending all of this money on responsive measures that are backed, really only by the threat of violence, instead of investing in our communities in the first place to prevent the crime. Look, none of us want to be victims of crime. But if we don't want to be victims of crime, then the idea is to prevent it. It's not to just respond to it. And I think that if each of us examines our own interactions, with police, for me, I know that when I've had my car broken into, when I've had my house broken into a couple of times, did the police fix that problem? Did they solve that problem? No, they didn't prevent it from happening in the first place, and nor did they ever actually even respond to it on the back end, right? So they in none of those situations did they make me safer. And I think a lot of folks are starting to wake up to the fact that, we've taken for granted that police officers are making us safer. I think that we've seen that on our televisions, in our cop dramas. But, when you actually start to look at the cold, hard evidence, the link between policing and crime is very tenuous. A lot of folks have studied this and have found it very difficult to say that, policing, that increasing the number of police officers or, actually reduces crime or prevents crime. And so, we could be investing this money in programs that do show a significant relationship to crime, programs that provide better housing, provide housing at all, that provide education, provide after school programs and safe places for people to live, work, and play.
Tahir Duckett joining us on the Unpublished Cafe, civil rights lawyer and founder of the Rethink organization in Washington, D.C., as we discuss defunding police. And you had mentioned, officers, armed officers going out on their beat and, you know, always feeling threatened, right? They always feel like at every corner that they're going to be threatened or whatever. At some
Well,
point,
they're trained to think that way.
well,
Yeah.
they're trained to think that way. Oh, okay. But do you think the
Yeah.
number of guns on the streets in the U.S. or the availability of firearms in the U.S. is part of the problem too? That's why they feel that way?
Certainly, right? I think that, there is no doubt that we have, something of, we have a bunch of guns on the street in the United States. And, that is certainly part of the story. But even with all of those guns, the number of homicides that we're talking about in most major cities every year, it's relatively low. Look, policing is not even among the top 15 most dangerous professions in the United States, at least according to like the deaths per year. In fact, if I remember correctly, I haven't looked at this stat recently, but if I remember correctly, I know garbage collectors see more deaths per person each year than police officers. I'm pretty sure landscapers do as well. And so, there is certainly a story that is often being told that, police officers, the job that they are doing is incredibly dangerous, and there are homicides, happening all the time that they are responding to, or that they are, or that they are investigating. And the reality is, in DC, for instance, last year we had just north of 60 homicides for the year. We have 4,200 police officers in the District of Columbia. So, that's 60 homicides generally. That's not the number of cops who were killed last year in DC. That's just the number of homicides in this, city of 700,000 folks total. And so, this, I think this is part of the framework that folks have to break a little bit, is that, real life isn't like Law and Order, where, police officers are spending all of their time, dealing with serious crimes, investigating to or responding to serious crimes. It's much more the sort of, security theater, just being out on patrol, just being out in the streets. And, all those folks that we are asking to just be out in the streets and live out in these streets for security theater, they got to find something to do with their time. And quite often that ends up being, in places that are over policed, like Black communities, it ends up being, harassing the folks who live there, trying to figure out, essentially trying to drum up a reason for their existence.
Tahir, I want to thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Tahir Duckett's a civil rights lawyer and founder of the Rethink organization in Washington, D.C. The idea of defunding police will mean scouring city budgets. Kevin Robinson's an instructor at the Arizona State University School of Criminology and Criminal Justice as well. He's the former assistant police chief for the city of Phoenix, and he joins us now. And Kevin, how did police budgets get so big for cities?
Well, I think the easiest answer to that question is police departments have become so, the end all to most municipalities. People have come to rely on police departments for everything. And conversely, their budgets continued to grow as they continued to ask for more and more things to do what they were asked to do.
You mentioned they're relied on for everything. Obviously we talk about, dealing with crime, but what's the rest of the job that is taking so much of their time?
Well, it's the order maintenance types of calls. It's calls that people will automatically call the police for. And over time, the police have become used to responding to and dealing with and helping to adjudicate those issues, those concerns that people have. But in reality, they really are not crimes. They're civil matters. They're issues that one neighbor may have a complaint about another neighbor for one reason or another, and they call the police. So the police come out, and they talk to each side, they find out what's going on, they mediate, they make sure everybody is good, and they go on to the next call. So that is, what I mean by police becoming all things to all people, and not to mention the mental health issues that I think law enforcement around the world is dealing with.
Do you think society's asking or expecting too much from police when you talk about them being relied on for everything?
I don't think they're asking too much. I think that they've been expecting too much in return. And what I mean by that, I think it's good for the police to be engaged and involved with the community, but you can't expect the police to solve all of the problems, especially some problems and using mental illness as an issue. You know, somebody having, issues related to mental illness, and the police are called because someone may be acting strangely, or they seem out of place in the area they happen to be in. And you have to ask yourself, are the police truly equipped to deal with somebody who may be mentally ill? And the answer is no. I think they do a very good, the try is very good. They try to do the best they can. But the reality of it all is they may not have the expertise, they may not have the resources, and sometimes they may not even have the time to deal with someone like that effectively.
When did policing go from walking the beat to armed to the teeth?
Well, I think as we have gotten bigger and bigger and bigger, and I'm talking about our communities and more spread out, and I think once the police truly got into the police cars and got away from getting to know the people on the street corners and getting to be able to talk to the parents sitting on their porches at night and things like that, that's when police work really ceased to be the type of police work that I think we all envision it to be.
Kevin Robinson joining us on the Unpublished Cafe from Arizona State University School of Criminology and Criminal Justice, as well the former assistant police chief for the city of Phoenix. You know, in a defunded police scenario, how do you see community policing work?
Well, when we say defunded, I hope we're talking about people or cities reallocating funds. Police departments should always take a hard look at their budgets. And I did when I was in charge of the Phoenix Police Department budget. At the time, it was about $500 million a year. And we would go through exercises of reducing our budget by 5, 10, and 15% and ask ourselves, what would our department look like? And what police departments should do is take a hard look at the programs that they are performing, the services they are delivering. And if they are not meeting the overall organizational goals, if they're not helping people to feel safe, if they're not reducing crime, then you have to ask yourself, should the police be doing it? And if they shouldn't be doing it, those are the programs that can be easily reallocated. You take those monies, you put them back into the general fund for the city or the municipality, and they reallocate it to maybe an after-school program, to the Parks and Rec department, maybe even to mental health awareness or mental health treatment or drug treatment. There are other avenues, other places for the monies that are usually meant directly for police departments that, it could go elsewhere. And in return, hopefully, if everything is working the right way, the calls to the police department are reduced because you no longer have that specific problem.
The mental health issue is foremost, as you mentioned, for pretty well any officer around the world. That's something they just have to deal with right now. In terms of you call it a decrease in crime if those programs work. When I look at Camden, New Jersey, it started out all right, but where did you see them going wrong?
Camden, New Jersey?
Yeah.
What I know about Camden is they started from scratch. They started all over. They started with a different philosophy, a different mindset. And when they tore the police department down, they had the neighboring sheriff's department that was able to come in and continue to deliver services while the citizens of Camden, working with criminal justice professionals, were able to reinvent their police department. And that reinvention of that police department dealt a great deal with community interaction. And what they did right is Camden realized you cannot police at people. You should police with people. And that way, citizens become a part of the problem-solving equation.
It almost gives them, something tangible that they're getting out of it.
It does. It's buy-in. They have skin in the game, and they want to see success. And what you have happen then are, the neighbors, the people, the citizens, when they see something that's not right and they have faith in their police departments, what do? Pick up the phone and they call their favorite police officer. They call the police station and say, hey, this is what I've seen going on for the last couple of days. You guys need to keep an eye on this. So in essence, your ability to understand what's going on in the changes and maybe possible crimes that might occur in the community, the eyes that you have out there they're multiplied, several times over. And it then allows the police department to be, more effective when they go out to deal with a problem.
Kevin, I want to thank you for joining us.
No problem. It was my pleasure.
Kevin Robinson's an instructor with Arizona State University's School of Criminology and Criminal Justice as well. He is the former assistant police chief to the city of Phoenix. And this leads to our unpublished .vote question. Should Canadian cities adopt a community policing model? Yes, no, or unsure? You can log on and vote right now. I want to thank Alex Del Carmen, Associate Dean and Professor at the School of Criminology, Criminal Justice, and Strategic Studies at Tarleton State University in Texas. Tahir Duckett's a civil rights lawyer and founder of the Rethink organization in Washington, D.C., and Kevin Robinson at Arizona State University, as well, the former assistant police chief of the city of Phoenix. And I want to thank you for listening to the Unpublished Cafe. Stay safe. I'm Ed Hand.